Good afternoon, everyone on the East Coast. Good morning here in California. My name is Fareed Vidge from ZL Technologies. I'll be moderating our webinar today. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us. Today's topic is around file analysis. Our webinar is titled Bringing Dark Data to Light Through File Analysis. Don't be afraid of the dark. We've got three great panelists with us here today. And before we got started, I wanted to provide a little bit of context around the discussion today. Information governance is obviously front and center to most organizations, and one of the areas that we've seen a lot of people focus on is what to do with the file shares, where oftentimes we have dark data, which Gartner defines as information assets that organizations collect, process, and store during general business activity, but fail to put to use for other purposes. To compound that, oftentimes, the challenge with dark data is we don't know what we don't know. So in today's webinar, we'll have three experts discussing this topic, talking about how to attack this challenge and the best way to try to get some of these initiatives off the ground. So before we get started, a couple quick ground rules. If everyone on the webinar could make sure they're on mute, that'll just make sure that we don't have any disturbances over the next hour. And with that, I would like to first introduce our guest panelists. So first and foremost, we have Cheryl McKinnon from Forrester Research. Cheryl is a principal analyst serving the needs for enterprise architecture professionals. She covers all the trends, challenges, and recommended practices for managing enterprise content. And her focus has been in providing research and advisory services into the ECM space, as well as content archiving, enterprise file sync and file shares, document-centric collaboration, lifecycle management, information governance, and e-discovery. She's also a longtime member of AIM and ARMA, so we'll have a great industry perspective from Cheryl here today. And Cheryl, thank you very much for joining us. Joining Cheryl is also Bennett Borden from DrinkerBiddle and Reef. Bennett is responsible for the firm's data analytics strategy, and Bennett brings a truly unique perspective as being one of the first lawyer data scientists where he advises DBR and their clients on the development and use of analytics models that enable insight, data storytelling, and economic value generation. A lot of Bennett's groundbreaking research has also involved improving legal outcomes in key corporate events that include mergers and acquisitions, information governance, and litigation practices. Bennett, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And finally, we have Linda Sharp. Linda Sharp is the Associate General Counsel at ZL Technologies. Linda has been in the legal profession for the better part of 3 decades, and over the last 15 years has focused specifically on data management initiatives for the Fortune 500, as well as several federal and state agencies, helping to advise in several different areas, including e-discovery, information governance, data privacy, and security. She also sits on the board of OLP and ACC's Information Governance Committee. So we'll have a great in-house perspective from Linda here today. Thanks a lot for joining us, Linda.
Thank you, Fareed.
So going into the agenda of what we're really covering today, it's actually short and sweet and quite straightforward. Up front, we're first going to talk about what is file analysis. When we talk about dark data and how to address some of this dark data hidden in our file shares, what are we actually talking about? What's happening in the industry? And Cheryl's going to be able to provide us a good overview there. We're then going to talk about how we actually get a file cleanup project off the ground. Obviously, this is something that a lot of folks are focused on, but with numerous stakeholders involved within an organization, it's often like herding cats and trying to get all the right people in the room. So a big focus will be on how you actually get the project off the ground and set it up for success. And then finally, what do I do next? So, let's say we engage in a file cleanup project successfully and start that journey. How do we make sure we set that up for success? And once we go through that initial phase, what do we do afterwards to make sure we don't end up with the same problem a few years down the line? So with that, I'm actually going to ask Cheryl to jump in for a few minutes to give us some background on, what is file analysis. So Cheryl, I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thanks very much. So let's move forward to the next slide. So when we talk about file analytics, some of the things that we see the primary use cases for are, organizations want to be able to find and assess the documents, various forms of unstructured information, and get insights into either its sensitivity levels, confidentiality, its age, or its type, in order to assess its usefulness. We see that information governance really is a primary use case for file analytics, and that they're being used to help prepare for things like migration activities, file cleanup, content repositories or file shares, or even, identify those opportunities to dispose of duplicate or obsolete content. So, really interesting area, a lot of heat in this area right now when I talk to my enterprise customers. So I think this is a really good topic to continue to explore. When we talk about our business technology agenda, this is something that Forrester has been talking about the last few years. It's a recognition that enterprises are shifting a lot of their technology spend, not just into a lot of the back office technologies, that we've been investing in over the last few years in terms of storage environments and so on, but we really want to be able to better use our content and our data to really drive corporate mission, whether that's growth, whether that's customer service or experience, whether that's to better meet compliance obligations. That's really where we're seeing this investment. And when we talk about the business technology stack, that's kind of a 4-layer approach, and we see things like file analytics, content archiving, enterprise content management tools residing in that infrastructure and context layer that you see there. Many of us work in knowledge-intensive businesses. We use our intellectual property to drive engagement with customers and prospects, and we need to know that we're protecting that information in appropriate ways and using the right up-to-date current content to make decisions, so we're not making poor decisions. What's really important, especially in many of the regulated businesses as well, is that we have consistent execution of policy, whether that's related to security and access policies, lifecycle management, retention, legal hold. There's any number of policies that we have about handling our content and our data, and one approach to making sure that we are being consistent here is to look at things like file analytics and make sure that we are getting rid of things in a timely fashion, but also delivering information to the people who need it to make those business decisions. If we don't know it exists, if we don't know where it is, it's hard to use it appropriately. So we really see this as being an important underpinning, helping companies provide these guardrails and guidelines for the growth-oriented businesses that we serve. Next slide. So we talk a lot about insights as well, and this whole emerging area around analytics, and there's a lot of file analytic technologies that fall in this space, don't just help with some of the governance and compliance obligations that many of us have, but also help deliver information to the right person at the right time. We think that there's going to be a real big interest in using some of these technologies to help extract meaningful data from the content that's out there, whether it's in unmanaged file shares or other content repositories, to help contribute content into these systems of insight. We're seeing a lot of heat right now around organizations making investment in analytic technologies to help make better decisions, to assess those trends. And I think content, in terms of the documents that we have, are really an underserved kind of constituent in terms of participating in some of these new insight-based systems. So we want to be able to get also adoption patterns. Do we really know what kind of content is being consumed? Who's reading it? Who's actively working with it? So that we can, kind of be more strategic around how we create and update content. So getting those insights into adoption patterns and its use as well. And of course, we do need to make sure that we're keeping our obligations to meet compliance requirements. If we, by law or by regulation, need to dispose of perhaps personally identifiable information that might be sitting in a contract or an agreement, we need to have the technologies to help us do this in a timely fashion. Another really big area of opportunity that we're seeing is organizations wanting to automate the categorization of their documents as well as classification. So being able to use metadata to organize information by its use case. So what department does it belong to, what customer group does it serve, what product line does it belong to, but also help establish things like sensitivity levels. What's confidential, what's intellectual property, what do we need to make available versus lock down. And of course, I think some of the other promising areas that we see around analytics is also helping to understand the connections between people and the content to help enrich some of the collaborative experiences. So there's a lot here in terms of opportunity to use some of the analytic tools to dive into our document bases, to get rid of what we need to, but also put the content back to work where it makes sense. Next slide. So we do a lot of surveys at Forrester, trying to keep on top of where our customers are going. We do an annual survey of our enterprise content management readers and those businesses who have inquiries in this area, and we're asking the questions around, where do you plan to adopt things like content analytics, auto-classification or auto-categorization tools. And we see that there's still a lot of opportunity on the table. 38% have interest, but no deliberate plan to actually do anything right now. A further 15% plan to do something in the next year, but we do see also that 16% have some kind of implementation already in place. Only 2% of organizations have no interest in some form of analytics for automation purposes. Next slide. So we then wanted to understand, well, where are people finding the value, and where are analytics actually delivering some value? And it's interesting that the top response at 40%, and this was a choose all that apply question, is to in fact automate the categorization of documents. So organizations want to get a handle on all of that unmanaged data out there and be able to organize in ways so that we can actually make sure that we're getting rid of them in a timely fashion, or that we are able to improve things like search and collaboration because we know what these documents are all about. Second response at 28% was to extract data from content using things like OCR or ICR. And then we get into organizations really focusing more on the compliance use cases. So at third response here at 19%, e-discovery or early case assessments. And then we have things like automated declaration of business records and so on. So interesting to see kind of a mix of use cases there. Next slide. It's really interesting that we see the rise of file analytics because we're starting to see that organizations are realizing that there's a whole volume of content, of documents out there in their various content stores, whether those are desktops, laptops, file shares, even relatively unmanaged content repository systems. And this is becoming a bit of a problem for the people who worry about things like business records. One of the things that Forrester does on an annual basis, we've been working with the industry association ARMA for the last 7 years, and every year we survey their member base on various trends facing records and information management professionals. This year, in 2015, we surveyed and asked the question, so what are the top challenges facing your records management program? And the #1 response this year, for the first time actually, was the volume of unmanaged digital documents that sit outside of traditional records management control. So I think this really speaks to the fact that we're hitting a bit of a crisis point in terms of getting our document stores under control. And the volume of information, as we know, continues to grow and expand. And really, if we're not looking at technology to help us with this, it's going to be a long haul to really make a dent here. So interesting that we can see the opportunities very clearly in our survey data. Next slide. All right.
Thanks very much for that overview, Cheryl. So there's a couple things of interest that I noted there, especially on that last slide, where if you look at some of those survey stats, what kind of struck me was 43% said that the volume of unmanaged digital documents are outside of records management control. And you know, with more and more conversation around big data analytics, and you know, Cheryl, you made some very key points about using this information not just from a governance perspective, but actually, you know, for the business from a competitive perspective. I was curious, Linda, if you wanted to offer your perspective, you know, from being in-house counsel, as organizations start to look more at big data analytics, how does that really intersect with governance and some of the areas we're talking about here?
You know, that's a great question, Fareed. So one of the things we have to kind of think about, right, as we look at information from an enterprise perspective, it's that same piece of documents, that same document, that same piece of data that everybody wants access to. And it's the timeliness of that information. So when we look at data analytics and governance, they have to fit hand in hand. They work together. So if we don't have a good governance policy when we go to run analytics, we're going to have untimely or tainted data, data that could create false positives within our analytics initiatives. So what we want to be able to do is try to make sure that we're looking at, when we go to run analytics, am I running it against the right data source? Do I have timely information? How am I going to gather this information together that meets this particular business objective? And as we're looking at from a governance perspective, we need to identify how long should I be keeping information? What value does it bring to the organization, and when is it no longer timely? So you have to really kind of look at it from both fronts. You can't look at them independently.
Great. No, thank you, Linda. And Bennett, I have to get your perspective there as well. You know, someone who's a data scientist and a lawyer, you're kind of right in the middle of that conversation. So, I mean, when you're working with your clients and also internally, how do you sort of counterbalance a lot of folks wanting to do, you know, analytics in their own little silo, and then having this disconnect from a lot of those governance policies?
Well, and Fareed, that's really precisely the problem, is that so many of the insights that Cheryl brought out of her research, and Cheryl, I got to give you a lot of props for the research you do. You're one of my favorite analysts in the space. And we find much the same thing as we're working with clients on helping to get their hands around data. The challenges that Cheryl pointed out around, there's so much information that it's very difficult for companies to try to get their hands around it. And it's bigger than any one perspective of any one stakeholder in the company can handle. And so what's interesting is that information has both value and risk associated with it. And the trouble has been telling those two things apart. Historically, companies have created information just as a byproduct of doing business. If you think about how you go about your day, you send emails, you enter stuff in databases, you send stuff to clients, whatever it is you're doing, that creates all this digital contrail, basically, of what you're doing. And historically, that data has just kind of piled up. We haven't been very good at all in telling the important stuff from the unimportant stuff. We all know that trying to rely on custodians to do that has been an abject failure. And so so we're seeing this confluence of all this volume of data, but we're also seeing an understanding that this information has value to it. And so our senior management are people who have grown up really in the information age. These senior managers are people who have grown up with an iPad as toddlers, right? And so seeing that there is value to information, especially leveraging it. And so it's not as difficult to convince senior stakeholders that there's value out there in information, and they're starting to expect that we can get value out of that information. So we're starting to see a lot more buy-in from senior executives and senior managers around this idea that information has value, that we should be able to leverage it. We're also starting to see technology that's finally come into play. It was interesting to look at some of Cheryl's research around what people are looking for in implementing is auto-categorization of data. That technology, some very impressive technology, including from Linda in your shop, are able to finally be deployed to help us get insight into our information and to tell valuable information apart from non-valuable. And so it's kind of all this confluence that's going on that's getting us to even be able to address this problem finally. And now the problem is, all right, now that we've got the desire to do this and there's technology that allows us to do it, how do we actually get a file cleanup project off the ground?
Exactly. No, and that's a great segue there, Bennett. Thanks a lot. And that really gets us sort of to the meat of the discussion today is, how do you actually get one of these initiatives off the ground? Who are the stakeholders that need to be involved? And just looking at something that I think most of the audience will agree. We've all felt within our organizations is, most organizations keep everything forever, and once information has lost its context, it's hard, if not impossible, to manage. Using a file analysis product to get a picture of what is in your unstructured data stores is a good step to trying to resolve that. So, Bennett, I'll actually let you sort of continue down the path you started. I mean, when you start looking at a project like this, what are some of the key elements you have to consider in getting it off the ground?
This is really the most important piece of this. We work with literally dozens of companies worldwide where trying to get a handle on especially their file share information, but email and other things as well. And what's interesting about these projects is you're trying to answer the question, what is important to me as a company to keep, right? Because too many companies start asking the question, well, what should I throw away? Well, that's actually a much harder question to answer than what's important to the company. Because we found that what you really have to have at every company is the answer to 4 questions. The first one is, what are our primary business objectives? The second is, what information do I need to accomplish those objectives? The third is, how long is that information useful? And the fourth is, what do I do when it's no longer useful? And it's interesting, to get the answers to those questions, you got to talk to a lot of different people. The problem is that if you look at all of our key stakeholders at a company, information stakeholders, they all have a different line of sight. If you'll flip to the next slide for just a minute, and then we'll flip back, just to show you this is part of a survey that the Information Governance Initiative did, where we asked people what disciplines are part of information governance, and you'll see we call this the pinwheel, and you'll see all these different information stakeholders around this wheel. And some of these you'll see are more risk-based perspective. So think security, privacy, compliance, e-discovery. Those are really risk perspectives on information. And then as you start to go around to the left, you see more of the value side when you get into big data and analytics and knowledge management. All those things, they have a value perspective on information. And what's interesting is both of those perspectives are absolutely valid. The problem is what historically has happened in companies is that one or more of these stakeholders has kind of led the information governance initiatives. And so the technologies they choose, the policies and procedures they put in place naturally align with their perspective. Well, the problem is their perspective isn't the only one, and what has to happen is the balancing of these perspectives at an enterprise level. For instance, if you look at marketing people, their whole job is to disseminate information, right? They want to tell people stuff about your company. Whereas if you look at security or privacy people, their perspective is to hold information in and protect it. Well, those two perspectives conflict, and so who wins? The only way to really solve that problem is to have a mechanism in place at a company where all of those perspectives can be shared and then properly balanced for the company, because every company is going to have different objectives, different risk appetite, regulatory and legal profiles. And so this is what we have found to put in place. So if you look at the prior side, the way to get a file cleanup off the ground is you've got to have a way to identify the key stakeholders in some kind of group, a committee, a task force, a board, it doesn't matter what it is, but you've got to have some way to solicit the opinions, and the very valid opinions, of these different key stakeholders for your company. And then you've got to have to figure out a way to properly balance those perspectives between, say, marketing and security for your company. Because you have to have those questions answered and that balance made before you start throwing stuff away or keeping stuff, because what you keep depends on what's valuable, and what's valuable depends on the answer to those questions. So we have found this is very much a measure twice, cut once kind of project, where you've got to have some of these underlying framework questions put in place and some way to solicit these opinions and balance them and come up with policies and procedures. Because once you do that, once you have the guidelines in place about how you're going to decide on the value of information and what you should do with that information while it's valuable, it actually makes the file share cleanup much, much easier. So you'll see 2 slides down. This is where we get into, you've got to figure out who are the, who should be accountable for this at your company. So not only do you have to answer the question, who are my key stakeholders, and there's always a handful, privacy and security and IT and HR, e-discovery, legal, business people, and sometimes finance. But then you've got to decide who's going to be in charge of the IG program and the file share analysis project. And it can fit differently in different companies.
Thank you, Bennett. No, that's actually a very interesting perspective that, to focus on, and I think we're going to move on in the conversation a little bit, but I think one of the questions we're going to come back to for Cheryl and Linda is, Bennett, you talked about focus on what data to keep as opposed to what to delete. And then we run into the question of, well, now everyone wants to keep everything. So that's definitely something we're going to want to get thoughts from Linda and Cheryl on here in a few minutes. And we do have the benefit, everyone, today that, I failed to mention this up front, of 3 very unique perspectives, because Linda, serves as in-house counsel, also advises a lot of Fortune 500s, Bennett as outside counsel, and then we have Cheryl as an industry expert, so definitely want to get your guys' opinion on some of those slides here in a minute. But Linda, do you want to talk a little bit about, some of the key areas that should be emphasized with those stakeholders once they are brought to the table, and some of the big drivers that are actually the reason people are going after these initiatives?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So one of the things I'd like to do before we move on, though, is kind of elaborate a little bit on what Bennett addressed, right? So one of the areas is we're looking at key stakeholders. We also have to look at change management issues. And that's because what we've seen over the past, creating policies, and those key stakeholders may be high-level executives or management, but we also have to remember that part of that key stakeholder team is, in fact, those business users, right? If we can't get the business users to meet the objectives that we need to have them do, or they don't see a benefit in it for them, what we're asking them to do will never get done. So we need to make sure that they're part of that team, that they're helping to make those decisions and those policies on what it is that they're going to now have to do with their data. Alternatively, what we'll find is individuals, taking that USB drive and bringing the data home and putting it on their home computer, which we're all very familiar with happening in the past. So we want to make sure that as we're looking at identifying key stakeholders, we're looking across the industry, not just within the executive level or management level, but actually talking to those business units. So to talk a little bit
about a great point.
No, go right ahead. I'm sorry.
No, just to emphasize that, Linda, it's really the critical piece. It's where we see most of these projects fall down, is that they have too many risk side people at the table, or at least not properly balanced with the value side, because it's really, the business exists to do stuff, right, to accomplish their business objectives, and everything that we do should be focused around getting them the right information at the right time with the right security and access for as long as they need it. And if you think about it in that way, it naturally falls to the value side of this information, and then a lot of the risk side questions simply get answered in that process. And so when we think too much on the risk side, we forget what it is the business is trying to do. And like with the USB taking home the files, right, they're doing that for a reason. There's some need that they feel like they have, and so saying you can't take home USB drives, that doesn't solve the problem. What is the need that they are trying to fulfill? And so when you talk to those folks about what it is they're trying to accomplish, then you can put something in place like some kind of remote access that's easy to use, and they don't have to take the stuff home.
I totally agree. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Cheryl.
I was going to say, this is one of the areas that we've been really digging into at Forrester, is taking a look at, what's the right role of even external stakeholders as you build out this governance framework. We think it's a really important starting point for companies that don't necessarily know where to start or how to pick a priority list, is to, drive that line of sight. Okay, what is the expectation of the regulators that are most critical to you in terms of information they're going to ask for, and what kind of response cycle is important to you? What's that line of sight in terms of what your customers expect if they're sharing with you sensitive information, that they can trust how you're going to govern, handle, ultimately dispose of that information they are entrusting to you. Same with business partners. If you're sharing intellectual property for a joint manufacturing effort, what's the expectation in terms of how you handle that information? And I think that bringing that deeper business focus to the Information Governance Steering Committee is absolutely essential. I mean, we talked about marketers as being disseminators of information, but think about how much data they collect as part of things like marketing automation programs, email marketing, customer relationship management systems. There's a lot of really sensitive information that marketers are governing and are the stewards of, and we need to include that in our governance strategies.
Thank you for that
That's
feedback.
what I have found with this perspective of what is your business objective, or even sometimes what we do with clients is what are your product lines? Like even if you're a services company, you've got product lines. What are the products you're selling? How do I develop those? How do I communicate those and deliver those? And if you look at what your business objectives are, and then think, okay, what information do I need to accomplish those? How long is it useful? Access, security, privacy, and then deletion. It just helps you think better about purposely creating information as opposed to having it just be a byproduct of your business processes.
That's a great point, Brendan. Actually, we're going to segue into that here in just a few minutes. So what we try to do is maybe kind of staying along the lines of our slide deck that we have so we don't get ourselves too far ahead, but a couple of things I wanted to make sure and point out. So two things have changed in this industry, right? It used to be the traditional model was an employee leaves the organization, you reformat the hard drive, and you give it to the next guy if they're not on legal hold. That's it. That's what we did. So unfortunately, according to the Gallup poll, we're starting to see that only about 50% of our baby boomers are actually still employed at around the age of 60. So 50% of our baby boomers, at least the higher-end baby boomers, are starting to leave the industry. So what do we do with their data? This institutional knowledge that they've created that now, unfortunately, how do we manage that? How do we track all the good things that they created for the organization over their 20 or 30-year tenure with the company? So when we talk to stakeholders, that's one big area to be discussing with them. What are you doing with that information? You've paid for that data to be available to you, and now that person is leaving. So how do I now track that information? Another thing to kind of keep in mind, I actually just came across an article just the other day, and it indicated that the huge numbers of mergers and acquisitions that took place during 2015. So they indicated that we are at the highest number of mergers and acquisitions in any point in time since 2007, and 2007 was in fact the record high. So now we've actually surpassed that. So what happens when we do mergers and acquisitions? Unfortunately, people have a tendency to be laid off, companies downsize. What happens to that employee's data? So these are all areas to really kind of get your stakeholders' attention about why they need to care, why they need to understand where their data is, what kind of information they have. But also, too, when I talk to companies about mergers and acquisitions, they just spent, I don't know, let's say $1 billion for a company, then they lay off 25% of their team. But what happened to that company's information? You just paid for that goodwill, all of that technology, all of that data. You're going to want to be able to mine that and provide analytics against it, because you may not have those bodies still around to help answer some of your questions. So when we look at stakeholders and why they should care, a couple of areas to think about too is obviously reduce costs. So when we talk about reduce costs, by minimizing the amount of data, implementing good governance policies, we're going to help to get rid of data that we no longer need, right? So one of the things that e-discovery, as ugly as it may be, shone a very bright light on the fact that over 50% of the data that is stored by an institution today has absolutely nothing to do with the nature of the business. It's the vacation photographs, the honey picket milk, it's all the other garbage that the individual employees create every single day. So I identify that information, potentially getting rid of that. But in addition to that, as we look at storage, how many times are we going to replicate that same document across our enterprise? So, Sally goes out and creates a document. She, saves it on her hard drive. She now attaches it to an email, sends it on to the 10 people working on the project. But in addition to that, all 10 of these people now turn around and save it in their file share. They save it out on the SharePoint site. That same document sits in a plethora of locations. How do we minimize that? How do we now eliminate? Then when we get into governance, how do I set records retention around that? Making sure that if I now testify to the judge or I sign up on a declaration on behalf of the client that they no longer have this information, do they really no longer have this information, or is it just no longer available in their records application, but the end user still has it stored somewhere out on their hard drive? Being able to track all of these potential problems. And that kind of then leads into risk, right? When we talk about risk, oftentimes we talk about areas around data security and data privacy. But if I have the information, I can't be subject to having that hacked into. So for example, I hate to bring up Sony, but we're all kind of pretty much aware, since it's fairly recent, what happened on the Sony project. And unfortunately, if they didn't have a lot of that information because it had passed its useful life, it was no longer purposeful for the business, they may not have, the hackers wouldn't have ever gotten access to that data. So some of the things to kind of be thinking about. We also want to talk about enables better management and information decisions for unstructured data. So as we're looking at it and we're looking at ways to be mindful of our information, how timely is that data? If I'm making business decisions and I'm running a data analytics process across that, I want to make sure that, number one, I have the most current information possible and available to me. So a lot of technology out there today, unfortunately, allows you to, collect and then dump it into a tool, and then they run the data, and analytics across that data set in that tool environment. But what happens after a month passes, or 2 months pass, or 3 months pass? My information is no longer valid. So how do I make sure that I'm maintaining timely access to my data? And along those same lines, we want to make sure that we're looking at the governance side. I want to make sure that I'm not getting a bunch of static when I'm looking across my information. And again, this is huge for our key stakeholders. When we're looking at the executive team, they need to be able to make mindful, accurate business decisions based upon the information that we're gleaning out of your data stores. So the only way to do that is if we make sure that governance and analytics work side by side. Increases of efficiency of business. Sorry?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. We look at increases of efficiency and business critical data, right? So what we want to make sure is that we're getting the right information. I think we've all had the opportunity, we run a Google search, right? And what winds up happening, it comes back with 10 million search results. Well, that's great, but the unfortunate part is that one document you might need might be that one that's at 9,999,000th document, but you're never going to get to it because there's just too much there. So making sure that you're implementing good governance policies so that when you apply data analytics, the stakeholders get back the valid information that they need access to.
So Linda, one of the areas that I think folks would definitely want to talk to a little bit more. Obviously, you talked about cost reduction, and the C-suite generally wants to hear about increasing revenues or reducing costs. So that's always a good way to start building the business case. A couple stats from some of our industry experts. Obviously, the e-discovery and governance markets are just sort of blowing up year after year in terms of the amount of money that organizations are spending to handle their information governance challenges. But I know there's some basic math and an interesting perspective you use in even starting off that business case. So I was wondering if you might be able to speak to that a little bit.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of things that people need to take a look at, or we need to focus on when we're looking at starting an information governance initiative. Unfortunately, what happens is a lot of times people try to figure out an ROI, and they look at every single nitty-gritty little potential place where they might find dollars. Well, the reality of it is, if we can just do something very basic, literally as simple as identifying the amount of time that I'm going to reduce in two places. One, the time that it takes for an employee to keep their mailbox cleaned up. Just going through and getting rid of the junk emails that come in every single day, or responding to emails and putting it into some file folder structure, or assigning that then to a records application. Another area that we see a huge problem is the fact that how many times do you spend looking for something that you created, but you just can't remember where you put it? Or I thought I did it about a month ago, or maybe I want this crafty language from a contract that I drafted, and I love that paragraph I wrote, but I can't remember which project I was working on when I drafted that contract. Being able to just at your fingertips search and find that information and get rid of the junk out of the data store. So some simple basic math. That took a policy of about 10,000 employees in this particular company. If each employee saved 15 minutes a day on all these different kinds of tasks that deal with our data. 5 days a week, assuming a 49-week year, so that number may change depending, especially if it's a European company, comes out to about 612,500 hours per year. Multiply that by about $20 an hour, which of course, as most of us all know, would be an extremely nominal labor rate, right? You can find that labor rate number very easily by asking your HR department, what's our average labor rate? It comes out to about $12 million a year in cost savings, just by making it easier for the employee to do their job every single day. And then we added on here, just based upon the size of the organization, some very, back of the napkin kind of numbers of what you might be able to save overall. The bottom line is, people tell us every day, I can't figure out the ROI for creating an information governance initiative, when in fact, some very basic math can help them get to where they need to be.
Thanks, Linda. And Cheryl, if you want to comment a little bit on what sometimes is can be a slightly more challenging conversation, which is really trying to articulate the risk factors and some of the risk reduction that you're going after. I would love to get your thoughts there.
Yeah, this is a big question for a lot of our large regulated customers at Forrester is, how do I get a handle on, protected or sensitive information? And, this really does start with a good, straightforward, ideally simplistic policy. We do see that organizations sometimes get very complex in terms of various classification levels for different forms of content and data. Usable data classification and content classification systems start with something that's approachable to the day-to-day information worker that actually create it. But that being said, we know that there's a lot of information that often sits relatively ungoverned, perhaps even unsecured on network devices. We see this come up frequently, for example, if there's a breach because sensitive data either hasn't been protected or hasn't been disposed of in line with policy or potentially even laws or regulations. And this becomes a big challenge when organizations are migrating data, for example, moving it from file shares into a content repository service, and suddenly you've got a great search engine and reveals all kinds of interesting stuff that should have been protected, but was so hard to find on the file shares that it was kind of a security by obscurity. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity for organizations to get their security governance house in order in this area.
Cheryl, I'd like to add that if I was just going to say, I'd like to add just real quickly too. So one of the biggest areas that unfortunately we in the legal departments have a tendency to be culprits of, that exporting of data, right? So we have a litigation matter, we export the data to third-party providers. So that's one area that you might want to take a look at. How much data is leaving your organization? What happens at the end of the case? How do you make sure you get your data back? And what those processes actually look like within your organization.
Thanks, Linda. And Cheryl, thank you for your comments there as well. So we're going to try to move a little bit faster here through these next couple sections because as usual, I failed at my job and not kept this tight enough. So, Linda, if you want to talk a little bit about, setting the scope of the project, as you're trying to get this off the ground, and this is something we're going to revisit at the end of the discussion and get Cheryl and Bennett's thoughts on as well. But sort of coming back to what Bennett had said a little while ago as well is, focus on what to keep, not so much on what to delete. It's often an easier question to answer, but when you're looking at that scope, how do you sort of balance not biting off too much, but at the same time making sure you're doing something that's going to set you up for the future as well. So if you want to talk maybe a little bit about, sort of setting the scope of that project so that, you really can make it a success.
That's a great point, Fareed. So here's the thing to kind of keep in mind. If you can go ahead and go back to that screen. Thank you. So as you're looking at your project, right, oftentimes what will happen is people look at the overarching, all-encompassing enterprise. And unfortunately, that's too much to bite off at the very beginning. You have to start somewhere. And then what you want to be able to do is get those success stories under your belt, and then you can build on that and you can expand it across the organization. If you look at the entire enterprise, nothing will ever get done. It'll never happen. So as we take a look, you want to look at, where your corporate file shares are. Do you have SharePoint data? How many SharePoint sites? Unfortunately, SharePoint's a fantastic product, but we've seen a tremendous amount of SharePoint sites where organizations gave everybody unfettered access to be able to create a SharePoint site. So now there's tons of SharePoint sites out there that nobody has any clue what's in that data. As you're looking at, who needs to be part of that business case? How are you going to build that? You may have areas in your organization that are ripe for this kind of need. They need to know what information they have. They need to have access to that information. But maybe the management team or the actual individuals within that group really aren't ready to take on this kind of an initiative. So even they may be the best target, they may not work out well for your project because of the fact that they're not going to embrace moving forward. So what you might want to do is even look at areas where you have management and team member buy-in to do something about managing the data. So what type of business do you have is going to be absolutely critical about how you start your initiative. Where do you want to start? How much are you ready to bite off? And that's a big problem, right? How much budget can you potentially get? How much money can you save the organization that you can justify that budget? Do you have enterprise-wide authority? Unfortunately, what we're seeing quite a bit of right now is tremendous number of committees. Everybody has a stake in the committee, but nobody actually owns responsibility for getting the job done. Nobody owns the responsibility for going back to the executive team and saying, this is where we are today. I speak quite frequently with a lot of organizations where they tell me, oh yeah, we have a committee, and the question is, so how long have you had that committee? You know, how far have you moved forward? What opportunities are you now looking at? How are you going to develop this? What's your plan? And unfortunately, each person is only responsible for the legal part or the records part or data security, but nobody owns the entire initiative. So that kind of gets back to a little bit what Bennett was saying earlier. You have to have a stakeholder. You have to have somebody who actually owns responsibility for what's happening. Next slide.
Thanks, Linda. So that really brings us to you know, the last segment of our webinar today, which is what do you do next? So, you know, once we get one of these initiatives off the ground, as this is all related to business analytics and governance, you know, what Gartner is saying is that by 2020, 80% of current file analysis solutions will be absorbed into broader data management or information governance solutions, and that's really talking from a technology perspective. And then there's there's other folks that are also emphasizing that the fundamental capability is to first really provide visibility into that data to discover and identify the data. But the next step, and where I think a lot of us believe really the meat of it is how do you classify and apply policies across this content on an ongoing basis, so that related to what Linda, you were just talking about, you know, how much can you bite off? Well, oftentimes we see two ends of the spectrum where folks are saying, well, we don't want to boil the ocean and look at all this future stuff and look at all these different, you know, data types. We just want to figure out a way to clean up our file shares and reduce costs with a very limited viewpoint. And then you have, you know, other folks that, you know, they're saying that, look, we need to put something in place where in 3 to 4 or 5 years we don't end up with the same problem again. We want these policies to be in place on an ongoing proactive basis. But then you end up with some of those challenges of, well, how do you actually get it off the ground and implement it? So once you have something like this in place, Bennett, maybe you can speak a little bit to, you know, how you actually set up a foundation so that you set yourself up for not just success for that initial project, but for larger information governance initiatives moving forward.
Sure, and that's a really important perspective to have, right, is what we're trying to do is to set up an IG framework so that not only do we solve the problem we have now, drain the swamp, but we keep the problem happening, we dam the stream, right? And so even approaching this on a project-based level, which I completely support, like Linda made an excellent point that it's very hard to solve these problems across the entire enterprise, but it isn't that hard to clean up the file share in HR, right? That's a much easier project, and it requires much less authority, it requires fewer decisions, but it also helps inform these larger long-term decisions, because as you're starting to form a committee, which we think is very important, you know, a committee that these stakeholders, and you start to get their perspectives, it's hard to talk in the abstract, like what's important to the company. That's really hard. But if you can give them a report out of a file share and say, well, look, I found 32,000 of these reports and 16,000 of these kinds of stuff, what's the value and the risk around those specific things? It often informs the policies as they go forward. So what we find with these project-based approaches to IG is you start to develop these overarching policies around how decisions get made about IG, so how the IG committee functions, how business comes before them, how do they decide ideas or issues, and how do those get effectuated into policies. How is your legal hold process, your litigation response protocol, because that's going to affect all of your different systems. And so as you're starting to approach a specific project, it's important to have kind of this longer-term view of how are these projects going to inform our ongoing policies. And as you do more of these projects and get more success and prove more ROI, then you'll find they're easier to do, and many of the questions have been answered by prior projects and incorporated into policies. And so then you have, before you know it, you've really got an up and running entire program.
You know, Betty, I'd like to add to that too. So it's kind of like building a building, right? I have to have a plan. You know, I'm a firm believer in the expression, you know, fail to plan, plan to fail, right? So, but that doesn't mean I'm going to put the roof on before I lay the concrete, you know, foundation. So each of those layers have to meet a particular objective where we're trying to get somewhere at the end of the day. But I might have to start with my foundation first, right? And then just keep building on that.
And constantly focus on the value proposition. I will tell you that time and time again where these IG programs have failed is they have focused too much on risk, and it becomes a naysaying kind of endeavor. Business people, especially senior executives, their whole purpose is to accomplish something. And too many of our risk-based conversations are about don't do this, don't do that. And we become this voice that gets ignored over time. And so what our message has to be is, I can help you do what you do better. And here, so let me show you how. And that's where you start to get much more buy-in from the top as well.
That's a really good point. I would agree with that. When we talk to organizations that are trying to formulate their information governance stakeholder teams, one of the things we advise is, you know, structure it so it can stay evergreen, right? If it's being formed because of the result of a failed audit or, you know, e-discovery costs are through the roof, you know, that's a very tactical problem. You know, that's priority one for the first year and a half, but then you've got to have that team, you know, be fluid and respond to what the other key corporate missions are. So if priority one is cleanup because of e-discovery costs in year one, but perhaps in year two, it's, well, let's remediate all these, you know, 4 different customer relationship management systems because we've been acquiring companies. You've got to have that stakeholder committee, you know, be very tied to corporate objectives and stay fluid to respond to where the hot spots are.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thanks, Bennett and Linda, for your perspective there. So we're starting to get towards our wrap-up. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left, and I wanted to take the opportunity to, you know, quickly summarize some of the key points that that our panel has emphasized as our audience starts to look at these initiatives, starts to look at different solutions and technologies that, you know, you might want to put in place to help tackle some of these challenges. So some of the key things to consider is, one is always looking at, you know, content versus metadata. As you know, Bennett and Linda and Cheryl all emphasized, it's not so much just about, you know, discovering the data and figuring out what you have, but actually making it actionable. So actually being able to apply policies after that, whether it's classification, whether it's for analytics, whether it's for defensible disposition, but being able to strike the right balance between not just looking at the metadata level, but also looking at the content to identify that sensitive information and then actually to be able to take some action on it. Related to that, obviously, is the fact that, you know, this isn't a one-time initiative, and I think we heard that loud and clear from our panelists in this, you know, last segment that we had. File analysis has to be part of that long-term strategy for broader information governance. It's not a one-time fix where, hey, look, let's go reduce our file shares by 60, 70%, and then go back to doing things the way we used to. The idea is when you approach this problem, not only putting together a framework like a long-term framework like Bennett and Linda emphasized that you can lean on moving forward as well, but even at the technology level, when you look at these solutions, you have to find something that's going to be able to help you in the short term in terms of discovering that data and taking some of those easier actions, but also sets you up in the long term to implement broader governance and be able to make this part and parcel of your ongoing governance strategy. And you know, finally, in you know, a comprehensive solution is again going to let you not just identify, but actually classify and take action on that data. and it has to fit into that long-term information governance strategy, which is obviously something that that is absolutely critical for all the stakeholders across the board within an organization. So with that, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, and we do have a number of questions that have come in from the audience. So while we still have our esteemed panelists here with us, we're going to try to run through a few of those. So the first one is, we obviously have a pretty diverse audience here. We've got folks from records, IT, governance, various different stakeholders. And one of the questions that came in is, a lot of these projects, because they are file share, they're based on the file shares, they're based on maybe storage costs or reducing infrastructure costs. They're often driven by IT. So as a stakeholder coming from legal or information governance, how do you insert yourself into that IT conversation to actually be able to bring that perspective to a project like this as well? So Bennett, maybe you could start with providing your perspective there.
Sure. IT is absolutely critical to an IG program and an IG project, but they are the least equipped to make decisions about content. IT, the information technology function, and even the CIO function really has nothing to do with information. They are infrastructure people. They want the lights on, the pipes flowing, controlling access, but they really do not care what is in the data. It's not their job, and it shouldn't be their job. And so decisions about what is important to the company and how long it should be kept, those questions have to be answered by the business side, the value side, and the risk people. And so IT is absolutely a facilitator in this and critical player to it, but they can't answer those questions. And so if you're trying to get involved in a project where IT has been tasked with reducing storage costs by 50%, again, your message is, hey, I can help you do that. Here's the questions we start to ask. What's in here? Why is it important? How is it important? What business objective is it helping us accomplish? And that will naturally pull in the business people and the risk people. And so asking questions that IT can't answer is how I've gotten the other people involved.
Okay. Cheryl, Linda, would you like to offer your perspective as well?
Sure. It's really interesting. I talked to a lot of, senior technical roles and things like inquiry at Forrester, and I often will get the question about, where do I get started? And I'll often say, well, do you have a retention policy? Do you have a records management or legal team that you can turn to find out what your policies are? And very often that line of communication isn't very well established. Either they don't know where to turn, or, it's just not a habit to collaborate them on a regular basis. So I think, this is, they really do need to take a look at, where do we kind of form those cross-team collaborative connections so that communication happens and we don't have to wait until they're ready to pull the trigger on a project to actually figure out who to talk to.
I'd like to just add one little comment to that too, right? I mean, so the bottom line is we're in business for a reason. That's to create a widget, whatever the product is. And the data actually belongs to the business. So we have to ask the businesses what they need to have done and why they need to keep that information so that we have it for the life of the business to meet that particular objective. The rest of this is we all are here to serve the business. And that's kind of how I always look at this. Great that we need IT. We absolutely have to have IT. But the bottom line is we have to support the business unit.
Thank you, Linda. Thanks, Cheryl. So we're almost at the end of the hour, but we're going to try to squeeze in a couple more questions quickly for our audience. And this is a broader question, kind of hits across the board. But in your experience, Cheryl, Bennett, Linda, is coming from 3 different angles. What would you identify as maybe the top 2 or 3 mistakes that companies might have made in engaging in a project like this where they haven't been able to get it off the ground or they haven't been able to achieve the results? What are sort of the gotchas that you would identify and make sure people consider up front? Cheryl, would you like to start with that?
Sure. I think the first thing is focusing way too much on just cost reduction as the driver of the business case. I would say that's an easy number one. They're hard to be funded, and if overall, cost cutting is not mission one in terms of corporate priorities, it's going to get really hard to get that business case, to the executive table. If your company's focus is growth, customer satisfaction, launching into new global markets, and you're coming up with, I can save you 10% in storage costs, it's just hard to make that fly.
That's a great point. And I think one of the things that I see most commonly is companies move too quickly into executing a project before they think it through. And so they, especially they start spending money on either a technology solution or a consultant before they've done a lot of work themselves. Like, so when I come in to work with a company, we have this thing, we literally call it corporate therapy. We put the senior executives in a room for a day and make them answer the question, why are we here? What is the meaning of life? Like literally, what is our most important objectives? We make them answer these questions that I talked about, because you have to go through that process before you can start to talk about what data is important to you and how to organize it. And so if you pull in technology too early and start spending money on it, you have to stop and answer those questions anyway. So sometimes the budget gets ahead of the outcomes or the achievements of the project, which is never a good place to be.
And I want to just add one quick little last, real quickly, Fareed, one last little quick point. I think as you're looking at that too, is as we're looking at how to piece this all together, right, we need to make sure that we have a plan that at the end of the day where we want to go and how we're going to get there. And then making sure that we're looking at technology that meets that plan. Because if we look at a piece of technology that fits this little problem and that little problem, we're looking at a bunch of different tools, but not necessarily an enterprise solution. So it's critical to understand how all of this is going to work together at the end of the day to meet our final planned objective.
Thank you, Linda. So on that note, we have run 3 or 4 minutes over. First and foremost, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Cheryl, Bennett, Linda. Thank you so much for joining us today and providing your perspective. Cheryl, Bennett, Linda have also been kind enough to provide some of their contact details. So should you have some follow-ups, you're always welcome to reach out. We're also going to be making this slide deck available. Again, a big thanks to everyone for joining us here today. And Cheryl, Bennett, Linda, hope to sit down with you guys again very soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the week.